So, what is walking? Walking is a repetitious sequence of lower limbs to move the body forward. I think we take it for granted how complex it actually is. Both, it happens with normal able-bodied gait. It seems fluid, but as soon as you throw in a pathology, whether it be a stroke or in the case of this talk, amputation, it definitely elucidates the difficulties of gait and how hard it is to actually transition smoothly. And one of the difficulties of translating smoothly is really stability. So if we look at a person here with a amputation, if they were just to balance on that left leg with the amputation, it might be very difficult to remain stable and upright. But when we move, we actually create some dynamic stability, and that movement and momentum actually make the stability stronger and better. And people with amputation have these adaptations and have these patterns that make it dynamically stable. So if the person stands still on that left leg versus moves and is in single limb support, the ability to be upright and keep moving forward or keep stable might be very difficult and very different between the two. Now with Gait, the four main goals of Gait is to move forward. It's to attenuate shock that occurs. So obviously the amount of shock will change based upon the speed you're going at, but that's why we usually flex our limbs. You flex your knee, you flex your hip. You do those things to help attenuate some of the shock and not just have like a rigid limb. We have a very stable gait. Obviously you don't want to fall over when you're walking. And one of the hallmarks of gait, and especially able-bodied gait, and hopefully with people with amputation, is they have a very adaptable gait. So it's not just safe, non-threatening surfaces, but is also walking over uneven terrain and their ability to maintain upright and move forward safely. Now, how you achieve those four goals is through really 5 objectives that's been outlined by Jacqueline Perry and others. Really, we want to have stability during stance. So we'll get into stance in a second a little more as a review, but we want to be stable when we're in stance phase, your foot's on the ground. You have to be able to clear your toe. If you don't clear your toe, then you're going to stumble or trip. Where you put that foot as you're leaving swing phase and you're coming down to the ground, where you put that foot is very important to actually lead to a stable, safe gait pattern. If it's too far forward, well, you can't progress past that limb. If it's too far to the side, well, you might be leaning too much to the side in a very energy inefficient manner. Do you have adequate step length? Can you actually keep moving forward where it's not too little, where you're actually going too slow and limited by the step length? Or is it too far where you actually can't get over that leading limb? And then energy conservation, how we move. If we look at our center of mass mechanics, how much we flex our limb versus don't flex our limb, all these things play a role in not wasting energy. And a hallmark of able-bodied gait is we optimize a lot of our movement patterns with energy expenditure. So how many steps you take per minute or your stride frequency, that usually occurs at an optimum of energy expenditure. What is your velocity? How fast you walk that gait speed? That usually occurs at an optimal amount of energy per meter traveled. So a lot of energy conservation and not wasting energy is a hallmark of able-bodied gait. Now, in my research, in amputee gait, we do still see these hallmarks, but the energetics or the amount of energy expended usually still elevated in that case. Now, with gait, and here's some specifics, and we'll stay at a high level during the different slides when reviewing amputee gait. But here are some of the things I'm going to be referring to. So when I think of a stride is comprised of both the stance phase and the swing phase. Stance phase is when your foot's on the ground, swing phase is when it's not on the ground. And when you're in stance phase, you have to accept your weight. And then from there, you have to then balance on one limb. So when you're accepting your weight, that's when you first hit the ground and then you bend and flex the leg a little bit to kind of shock attenuation or load the limb. And then as you move past that initial stages, you get to that point where you're in single limb support and your other limb is in swing phase. And at that point, you have to be stable and you don't want to be falling over to the side or falling backwards or forwards because of a number of factors. So that single limb and stance stability. And then you have to, work on advancing a limb during swing phase. So in pre-swing, you're technically still on the ground, but you're really just starting to get that limb forward. You're starting to really activate those hip flexors, and you're pushing off with your gastroc and soleus and really your plantar flexors of your ankle, and you're trying to push forward and advance that limb. As the other limb is now in stance, this current limb we're focusing on is going into swing. And to break it up in a little more picture format, here's that initial contact phase at the beginning of stance all the way through pre-swing when you're still on the ground and you're really pushing off and starting to use your hip flexors to bring your hip forward and bring your leg forward, all throughout the phases. Noting that in stance phase, you have a portion where you are in single support, where it's just one limb on the ground, but then you have a period of double support where your opposite limb is on the ground at the same time, giving you stability. And then in the swing phase, you have early swing, or initial swing, mid swing, and you have terminal swing right when you're positioning your foot to hit the ground before you have initial contact to start the next stride cycle. And a lot of the deviations we'll be focusing on today are in the early and middle portions of stance phase. The limitations of prostheses really show themselves in terminal to pre-swing, but we don't see as many deviations. There's just more limitations of really stride length and gait velocity because of those prosthetic limitations. And in swing phase, we don't see a lot of problems unless the prosthesis is poorly fitting. There's something else going on internally. So that's usually less of a thing than it is we see as far as stance phase deviations with people with amputation. Now, with gait in people with amputation, there could be a lot of reasons to cause atypical gait. It could be something as far as the device itself. It could be something with the person as far as pain. Is there something wrong with the residual limb? Do they have skin breakdown or skin irritation? Is it not properly fitting well? Is that fluctuating over the course of the day and they're not actually keeping up with the amount of socks they're supposed to wear to keep a good fit between the socket and the residual limb? So there are many things that can affect and lead to atypical gait in people with lower limb amputation. So when you look at it, you can, in the case of someone who's a non-PT, a non-prosthetist, you can notice, hey, that doesn't look right. Hopefully you can do that after today. And then you can refer them to whether it be a physical therapist or to a prosthetist. Depending on what state you're in, you are not allowed to adjust or touch that prosthetic. In the state of North Carolina, I cannot touch and adjust a prosthetic. I can recommend go see your prosthetist, but I can notice strength, range of motion. If there's pain or residual limb problems, I can address those. And then if you're in Massachusetts, through this with Brendan, you also are very limited on what you can do with the prosthesis. In the end, if it's a prosthetic problem, you have to refer to the prosthetist. If it's truly a pain or a musculoskeletal issue or balance issue that's beyond just a simple training program, you need to refer to your physical therapist or maybe even to the doctor if it's even that much more concerning. Now, one thing I want to note here, and it's not as the hierarchical piece of the presentation, but I want you to be very aware, prosthetic gait and amputee gait is very, very energetically expensive compared to able-bodied gait. And these numbers are a little older, but the big message is with amputation, you can have 9 up to 280, 600% extra energy expenditure compared to able-bodied gait. Now, obviously, those numbers are very extreme in the 600% range, but really, even with current technology, you see with transtibial gait, usually 3 to 15% more energy expenditure than non-amputee gait, and transfemoral still 100, 200% more energy expenditure to walk at the same speeds. So people usually move less, and they also they move less, and also they tend to overall have other problems associated with this lack of movement. And another take home here, the higher the higher the amputation, you get into your hip dysarticulations and hemipelvectomies, the energy expenditure also is very high. Those people also don't move very much and move very fast. But we do see these high energetic costs with prosthetic gait. Now, what I'm going to do next is I'm going to go through hallmarks of transtibial gait and transfemoral gait. And these are the two most common levels of amputation you'll see. Transtibial is slightly more common than transfemoral. In the 1970s, transfemoral was more common, but now really since the 1980s and better surgical techniques, transtibial is becoming more common, but still they're they're relatively equal. You also will see more vascular causes or people with more comorbidities with amputation, traumatic and congenital, and amputations secondary to cancer are less common than those from vascular complications. So they have maybe diabetes and some vascular issues. That is definitely the most common thing. Very big down here in the South, but also I lived up in the Northeast for many years, most of my life, and it's still much more common to have a vascular related amputation than it is to have a traumatic or congenital or cancer caused amputation. Now with transtibial gait, they can have patterns that are very similar to able-bodied gait. And when people are younger, fitter, healthier, and maybe say a military personnel, young, fit, has an amputation, not many other things that happened with the amputation, they can walk, and when they're wearing pants, you don't even know they're an amputee unless you have a trained eye. And even then, it's very difficult. But that's more the exception than the rule. When you have people who are older or have other comorbidities or problems, they definitely can have very characteristic things that you can notice they're an amputee, even though they have a relatively minimal loss of their lower limb. So if you first look here at the initial contact phase when they're going in, hitting the ground here, so that's stance limb, the prosthetic stance limb, is in a very similar position to a person's able-bodied or biological side. The ankle is in a nice neutral position. The knee is nearly fully extended to maybe slightly flexed, but very, very almost fully straight and very similar to the biological side. And if you look at the hip, it's flexed between 25 and 35 degrees. If it was a shortened step phase, you might see this limb further back and then have less hip flexion. But this is what a average to a high level transtibial amputee will look like at initial contact. Now, during the stance phase, after you move past initial contact, so here's initial contact again, now they're going into really the crux of stance phase before they go into toe off. We have this initial shock absorption that occurs by the prosthetic components themselves. So it's the prosthetic ankle moving, but it's actually the compression of either the carbon fiber components at the heel that will compress, or from say a solid ankle cushioned heel or a satch foot, the durometer or the stiffness of the materials that will compress more or less depending on how the durometer or stiffness of the material. So if it's very stiff, they will hit and they won't compress much and they'll rock forward very fast, which could be very unstable. Or it could be very soft and they can really compress. And imagine it, if it's very soft, it has to compress through all that material. It has to compress through a greater volume of material, and that can take more time. So it almost delays that initial contact in early parts of stance as they go into loading response. In most cases, with a properly fitted prosthetic and a proper foot for their weight and activity level, it can look, as far as that response, very similar to a person without amputation. During mid-stance, when your limb is basically right underneath your hips and your pelvis, it looks identical or nearly identical as far as the motion and the forces that are occurring compared to a biological limb. And then in pre-swing, this is really determined by the foot stiffness, the type of foot and the activity level. And really one of the things with a carbon fiber foot is that they try to load that limb to take advantage of that compression of the carbon fiber foot to then push off in a very strong manner. If they have a foot that doesn't load energy and release it, well, at that point, they're going to transition over it and not get response from it. But a person who's like a K2 or has the ability to walk community distances and beyond, they have usually carbon fiber energy storage components that can load up. And by doing that, if they stay with their foot back, their trailing limb back, and load it up, it'll then respond with more energy compared to a non-energy storage returned foot. So if they have a carbon fiber energy storage foot, they would tend to kind of delay that trailing limb, but also load it more and have a push-off that's near normal to a biological limb. Now, obviously, you throw in some active components and robotic actuators that actually inject power into the gait cycle, which are not very common because they're very expensive unless you are a veteran or in the military or workers' comp. It's very difficult to buy these $40, $50, $60,000 devices. you usually have less power and less push off at the end of stance, but it can be very similar with a carbon fiber foot, very close, and to the naked eye, it looks similar compared to the biological limb. So if you look at the stance phase, this really just shows the amount of moment or the forces that are occurring internally. What we see here is we see this is old data. We see the discrepancies of this moment. So here's a control. Here is a amputee who's high functioning. Once again, this is old data, but the push off can be similar. And this was from the 1980s actually. These mechanisms being used are much older, and now with newer components, this is less of an issue. Now, if we look at the knee more specifically during stance phase, we usually see decreased knee bending. So what's common is when you hit the ground and you kind of attenuate your shock, your knee flexes. But in the case of transtibial amputees, they tend to flex their knee less. Part of it is as they're loading their components and loading their device itself. Also, what happens is you can have leg length discrepancies between the biological and the prosthetic limb. So if you have a leg length discrepancy, because as the residual limb translates in the socket itself, they might actually have less knee flexion, try to keep it as straight as possible to make up for the differences in leg length. So that could be a prosthetic fit side, that could be a component piece. We typically see less knee flexion, less knee bending from loading response to pre-swing, so during mid stance, than we do with a person on their biological limb without amputation. Another thing that also might be contributing to the knee being more extended is the amount of co-contraction that is occurring. And it's believed that co-contraction is occurring to really stabilize the residual limb and bone in the socket itself to have good control and feel. So having that co-contraction may also be a reason why people have a more extended limb at the knee during stance phase compared to a biological limb. At the hip, with stance phase, people may have a little more hip flexion, so they may put their limb a little further ahead of them, greater step length on that prosthetic limb as far as getting out there compared to their biological limb. This is potentially because the biological limb can push off a little better and get this limb a little further, where this can't push off as much. You can't swing this limb as far. So it could be a prosthetic limitation. It could be a person trying to overstride a little bit and really get the good strong heel contact to make them aware of making contact with the ground. It's common to see a little more hip flexion. Now, really, with a good walker, you won't notice much of a difference, but with a person, you might see, oh, the intact versus the prosthetic limb, you can see a difference where they have a little more flex, or that limb's a little further forward on the prosthetic side than the biological limb. Now, what we've seen in EMG studies is that there's some more hamstring activation. This could be more of a controlling the limb piece, maybe part of the co-activation piece, but it tends to have very little effect on the actual gait mechanics as far as the motion and the forces with that increased hamstring activation. If you now key on the pelvis and the trunk segments, when you have people who are young, active, like non-active military, you have young active people, they don't really have a lot of deviations. But in the case of people who are non-active and non-military populations, you see a lot of deviations, a lot of trunk side to side. So people actually sway their trunk a lot to make up for the losses in output and also the lack of hip control and strength. So a lot of this is really training. So if you see someone coming in and they have a lot of trunk sway, like as they would go into stance phase here, you see them like swaying their trunk over to on top of or towards the prosthetic side. That's an indication they might have hip weakness, or they just don't trust their prosthesis and they're really trying to control it. So that can be more of a training thing. It may be a strength issue, glute med, glute min, glute max, but also could be just a neuromotor training piece to really help them avoid trunk side to side sway, like having them walk towards a mirror and notice the sway and say, okay, we're trying to reduce that sway with visual feedback potentially. But just like I said, in your active populations, young populations, you won't see a lot of sway, but in most of your populations, you can see these trunk deviations until it's trained out of them or you get rid of some potential deficits. Now, during swing phase, you want to get toe clearance. Now, with these feet, they don't have active muscles to bring their foot into dorsiflexion, so they have to clear that limb by flexing their knee or flexing their hip. So with this, if you have a microprocessor foot or ankle, well, then I'll do it for you. But those are not common because they're very expensive. But what is more common is you'll compensate with a little more knee flexion or with a little more hip flexion to really clear that toe a centimeter or two above the ground to avoid tripping. Now, if you see someone who comes in and their foot is way off the ground, like they're really flexing their knee, really flexing their hip, that could be a prosthetic problem, or it could be a person who's fearful and is trying to over clear, but that's very inefficient and also could be very unsafe because now they're really putting a lot onto their intact side to make up for that. So one thing with transtibial is you'll see a lot of your deviations early. Early on in rehab, you also see deviations in stance phase. You'll see less in swing with if it's properly fit and the person's had good gait rehab. And then how they walk is influenced by the stiffness of their prosthetic foot. If they are a K2, K3 ambulator, so community ambulator or community ambulator, ability to change cadences and velocities, those people can have to learn how to load their foot and use their prosthetic components like their carbon fiber to load it and use it for energy return. People who are lower level ambulators, your K1s and some K2s who are really on that borderline, those folks usually have lesser components and they just have to be more taught to be safe, and they're going to walk slower though, and for them it's more avoiding potential falls. Okay, so that was transtibial gait in a very fast nutshell. With transfemoral gait, it's a much more complex and also a much more common area of falls and such. So here's just a quick comparison. So here's another version of a person with a transtibial amputation walking their dog. It looks smooth. She can turn and she can still manipulate there. So it makes it look easy. And then here, slower, shorter step length, much more hesitant gait pattern with this person's wearing a Rio knee, which is a microprocessor knee, still on the market with updates, of course. But you can see the stark differences between the transtibial and transfemoral gait pattern and how one is can handle more challenges in turning, or this one here is obviously much more difficult, even with components that are microprocessor and have some technology where the transtibial gait, that person did not have those components. Now, looking at the ankle with transfemoral, depending on what foot ankle mechanism they have, it usually is very similar to a transtibial. In this case, they have neutral alignment at initial contact. They have a very similar posture at the knee and the ankle during at the ankle during mid stance, and at toe off, they're trying to load that toe to help push off and bring the leg forward, depending on what ankle they have there. But it'd be very similar to a transtibial, depending on that ankle foot mechanism. So during a terminal stance, one thing that is difficult is because now they have to load that toe and load that ankle and get that power generation. It is more difficult to push through that prosthetic knee to actually load that toe to have it push off. So that is usually less power, but really your initial contact and mid stance looks very similar, and it can look similar at push off depending on how much they can actually load that toe to push off. So you see here, this person actually has that obviously very smooth and good gait, even when it's slowed down. Now, if we look at the stance phase at the knee, this is where people do not flex their knee much at all. Reason being is if you flex your knee, it can be very, very unstable. So if that person, depending on their alignment, depending on the knee they're wearing, if they flex their knee too much, that knee can buckle and give out on them. And obviously, if it buckles and gives out on them, they're not moving, they're not walking anymore, they're not progressing forward, and it's a fall can be very dangerous. So they usually keep their knee very straight to avoid that buckling. And we see from initial contact, straight, 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 very almost no bending of the knee, even in a higher level gait like this person right here. So this is where you see a lot of deviations in a transformer. Obviously, they're using a prosthetic knee, but they're trying to avoid buckling. So you'll see a lot of compensations here at the knee, even compared to a transtibial. And then at the hip, watching there, usually more flexed early. So why they're usually more flexed early is because typically there's some form of hip flexion contracture of 5, 10, 15 degrees. So if their hip is flexed, their trunk is therefore flexed. So that's very common. Also, having it flexed more puts more demand and stretch on the hip extensors, and they use those hip extensors in mid stance to terminal stance to really load that socket and push off. So having it more flex and load those extensors can help with the actual mid stance to late stance, like loading and using those muscles and the residual limb to push on the socket itself. So that more flex posture may also be an adaptation, even high level minimal contracture, is to actually load the socket and therefore load the prosthesis and move forward. Now, remember, with a transform amputation, they don't have knee and ankle mechanisms and therefore have limited muscles to cross over and move. So therefore, the only source of active power generation is at the hip itself. So your hip flexors and some of the muscles that cross the hip, those are your only source of power generation, unless they have a robotic or active actuation ankle and knee mechanism, which, like I said, are many times is not very common because of cost. So if you see someone who's a little more flexed and also you might see a little tilting of their pelvis, that's not uncommon. We don't want anything excessive where they're really flexed forward or they're really tilted, but those are not uncommon things when they walk. So that was a very fast explanation, designed to be fast. A quick review of what you see in prosthetic gait with transtibial and transfemoral. I spend 8 hours on this material in much greater depth with actual amputees who come into class. But I hope this is a good review for those who are physical therapists and a good introduction for people who aren't physical therapists. But really got to think about that the deficits that you see. Those deficits that you see can be from prosthetic causes or the person. If it's a prosthetic cause, obviously send them to the prosthetist. If it's a training or strength issue, probably you can do that if you don't have a license. But if they have a true deficit and it's painful and there's musculoskeletal issues, please refer to their medical provider or physical therapist to really address those issues.